Hello and welcome back to a new animation tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at this aesthetic swiping animation, and we're going to recreate it using Framer Motion inside of a Next.js application. So let's begin. So let's begin with the preview of the animation. As always, here we have an image gallery, and you can drag it or swipe it either if you're on a computer or a mobile screen. Or you can click on these little dots and it'll take you to the correct image. I thought this was a pretty cool animation that I personally have in my portfolio website, and I thought I'd share how I made it. Quickly before we begin, you can always head to my website and you can find all of the source code for all of my tutorials. If you don't see it in the first latest post page, you can always go to the section under tutorials and it should be here. And you can quickly grab the source code from the GitHub. So let's begin by taking a preview of the starter code. So here we have a Next.js application, and we're at the home page here, and we're just rendering out gallery images as our title and our component of image gallery, and this is what we see. Now, taking a look at the actual component, we see that we have a React fragment. Just basically means that we just want to render out whatever is inside of this fragment without actually using an HTML element. And then we have some divs in order to encapsulate our information. For example, we have a paragraph tag here. We have a div that holds our image here. And we have another div that holds our dot. And this is mapping through our image gallery photos, which is an array that I have constructed here, consisting of an object that holds information about each image. For example, our image is image and it's imported from the top here from our public gallery. And these are just images I found from Unsplash, and the source code should include them. Then we have a description describing our image, which will go under here. And then we have our alt, which could be the same as the description, but for the time being, I'll just put an image of me. So for rotate, that will come in handy later, and we'll provide a width and height of each image. So all of this can be customized to your liking, but for now, this is what I'm using. And what you saw down here are just the animation variants that I'll walk you through later in the tutorial. Also, this dot filled icon is coming from the Radix icon library. It's one of my favorites. It is pretty limited, but I like that you can use class names with it, and I like their style. So as you may notice, we are not looping through our images, and this might seem kind of odd, but for this example, we don't have to map through images, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's begin by importing all of our images onto the page and make them accessible to the user. So instead of mapping, we're going to use state in order to hold the index of each image, and then accordingly we'll render what image we are currently at. This can be useful because in order to use the dots, we must know the index. Here I'm simply going to use a UseState snippet, and I'm going to define an array with an image count and a direction. And here we're going to set image count, and our initial state is going to be an index of 0 and a direction of 0. I'll show you what I mean for the direction later. And since we are using state inside of Next.js, we must specify use client. And let's import UseState here. So now in order to get access to our image that is active, let's define a variable named ActiveImageIndex, and we will use a min-max function that comes from PopMotion, which basically takes in 3 parameters. Here we have 0, which is the first index in our image gallery photo array. Then we have the length of the array, which is the total amount of pictures. And then we pass the image count. And this way, we won't increment the count too high and render a picture that we don't have in an array. Basically, what this wrap function does, it evaluates the third parameter given and determines whether if it's in between the bounds of the minimum and the maximum, and if it is, it returns the number. And if it's not, then it wraps it back to the starting index, which would be 0. Now with that in place, we can render our image accordingly. So here we're going to go through our image array and select the active image and then the actual image, which is here. As we can see, we'll select the active image index and then we will access the image property. And now instead of hard coding these values, we can easily just use the active image to give them to them. Furthermore, using the cn function, which if you have used shadcn component, you may be familiar with this. This is basically like a Tailwind merge function, which merges class names together. Here we can take a look at it. It's using the CLSX npm package and the Tailwind merge in order to determine what Tailwind class should be rendered. Okay, so here we're just going to pass in our rotate. So basically, since we specified our rotate property on each image so it's unique, we can rotate it accordingly. And for the rotate, it's nothing too difficult. It's just basically flip either side. That way we have a little bit of randomness. All right, now let's take a look at our code. As you can see, it rotated and we're on this image right here. Okay, so now let's add the dragging functionality to our image using framer motion. So here I have wrapped this image into a div and gave it a cursor of grabbing. And I did this because you can't give a motion property to the Next.js image, so it must be encapsulated in a div. Here we're just going to give this div a motion attribute. Basically allows you to implement framer motion into this HTML element. Now for our animations, we're going to use our variants of slider variants that I have specified here. We'll have an incoming animation, which will check the direction if it's left or right, and we'll use -1 and 1 to determine. And here we'll either animate it 100% to the left or 100% to the right. Now, if it's active, then we want the X position to be 0, basically where we've defined this picture to be. The scale should be 0 and opacity should be 1. And then if it's exiting, we'll check the direction and we won't scale it this time, and the opacity should be fading away. So basically this is what we've defined here. For the initial, it should be incoming. For the animate, it should be active. And for the exit, it should be exit. And then for the transition, I just like to clean it up and put the transition in a separate variable. That way we can use it amongst other animations within the same page. That way the animations look cohesive and together. So the duration will be ½ second and the ease is right here. Okay, so now to enable dragging animations, we must define that we want the dragging only to be for the X direction. So we can do either both X and Y, but for now we just want the X direction. Then our dragging constraints are going to be from left 0 and right 0, which means to each side of the page. Our drag elastic is basically the degree of movement that we allow outside of our constraints. Okay, so now we should be able to drag this image, and by default it will go back to its original spot. Perfect. Now for the logic. Okay, so let's begin by defining a drag handler. This will determine whether or not we're going to go to the previous or to the next image based on the drag movement. So here we're going to grab the drag distance, which is provided by the drag event from framer motion. We'll also define a swipe threshold to determine whether the user has swiped enough. Now, it's important to mention that if the user pulls to the right, the value of the offset will be positive, and if the user pulls to the left, the value will be negative. And I'll leave this here for a little reference and help. That way you can understand this function better. So if the drag distance is greater than the threshold, that means it's positive and it's above 50, then we can go back in the array. And if the drag distance is less than the negative swipe threshold, then we can increment the array. And here, just to make it clear for you guys, here I'm logging the value. If the user pulls to the left, we'll get a negative number, and if the user pulls to the right, we'll get a positive number. Hopefully that made it clear. Okay, so with that, now let's create our swipe to image function. So here our swipe to image function is going to take a swipe direction, and then based on that, we're going to set the new image count. We'll pass in the direction, then we'll either increment or decrement the count. Okay, so in order to make this work, we'll have to use the onDragEnd callback that we can use with framer motion, and we'll pass in the drag info to our dragEnd handler. In this drag info, we'll receive the delta, the offset at the point, and the velocity of the drag. But for now, we just need the offset of the X. Okay, so let's take a look at our animation. Okay, so as we can see, it's not really working. And this is because our exit animation is not running. And in order to fix our exit animation, we must use animate presence, which comes from Framer Motion. Here, we can specify if we want an initial animation on the page load. So we can just give this a value of false. Okay, and we can just grab this and place it down here. Now we need a unique key for each of the elements that are going to be mounted and unmounted. For this, we can use image count, since they'll have a different count. And now, as you can see, the exit animation is working, but the direction isn't really. Well, this is because we never passed in our custom property, which is the direction that we're receiving here on this animation. We're using the direction to determine what direction we're going. Here, under the key, we can just give it a custom of direction. And as you may remember, the direction is coming from the state. Okay, so now all that's left to do is to animate the p tag and make the dots work. So let's give this a motion attribute by defining motion.p. Instead of creating variants, since it's just one property, I'll define them in line. So for our initial, we want the opacity to be 0, animate will be 1, and then opacity will be 0. And this is what I meant by the transition. Now we can use the same slider transition that we used for the images. That way they all look smoothly and put together. And as you may know, we need the key for each p tag to render the exit animation properly. And now instead of this hard-coded tag, we can just go to the image gallery, use the active image, the one that's being displayed, and access the description property right here. And that's all we need to create our dynamic p tag. Perfect. Now for our dot filled icon, it's also quite simple. Here I've wrapped it in a span because we cannot use the motion attribute with this radix icon. So motion.span will give it the same properties as the p tag. And as you can see, nothing's changing. Well, that's because we need to make it fully black whenever it's active. So for this, we can wrap our class name in the cn function, and we can pass in if the active image is equal to the index, because we're mapping through here and we're getting access to the index of each dot. If it's matching, then we can render it out as a black text, which will basically paint the dot black. And as you can see, we actually have a dot right there that is transitioning smoothly between the dots and getting filled. However, this doesn't work yet. We can't click on the dot and go to the index. Well, that's a simple fix. All we got to do is update the state based on what index we click. Then we can provide an on-click callback function that calls a skip to image function. So let's create that one. Okay, so in our function, skip to image, we'll have the image ID, which is our index, and then we'll define the variable that can be updated here. So let change direction. And if the image is greater than our active image, so basically if our index is greater than the one that we're currently on, then we want a direction of 1. Else we want a direction of -1. We will assign the value accordingly to either direction, and then we can update the state. Now, if we take a look at our animation, we can see that everything works perfectly fine. Okay, so that's been it. I hope this video was helpful in any way. And if it was, please consider giving a like, and thank you for watching.